28 bullets. That is how many it took for a 25-year-old named Ronnie Martin to be left dead on a street in Atwater Village. His wounds counted later like spent rounds at a shooting range. He belonged to a gang called Frogtown, and he had crossed into the wrong few blocks of Northeast Los Angeles, and for that, he was shot 28 times and pronounced dead at the scene. Years later, the man responsible sat in a Los Angeles courtroom and smiled. He smiled while prosecutors described how he hunted human beings through the alleys of his own neighborhood, smiled while a detective compared him to Charles Manson, and smiled when the jury found him guilty before smiling again when they decided he should die for it. One prosecutor told the court this man seemed to enjoy killing, the way other men enjoy a hobby, and the city would come to know him as the monster of Atwater Village. His name is Timothy Joseph Mugie, and on the streets they call him Weech Rowe, Spanish for the light-skinned one, because his father was a white man of Scottish blood and his mother was Mexican. By the time the law finally caught him, he sat near the top of a very short list, because in 2002, only 11 people alive in the entire United States had committed more than 12 homicides, and he was one of them. The Los Angeles Times would later rank him among the 20 most notorious killers in California history, beside the Golden State Killer and the Night Stalker. This story did not begin in that courtroom, and it did not begin with 28 bullets either. It began on a quiet street north of downtown, in a neighborhood most of Los Angeles had never heard of, inside a gang older than the freeway that ran beside it. To understand how a skateboarding kid with a Scottish surname became the most feared shot caller in the city, you have to go back to where the streets raised him, and to the machine he would one day run like an army. Atwater Village sits just north of downtown Los Angeles, pressed against the Los Angeles River and the long gray ribbon of Interstate 5 right up against the city of Glendale. And in the 1970s, it was a lower middle class neighborhood, mostly Latino, the kind of place where families knew each other's children and the trains still rattled through on old electric lines. Those trolleys gave the neighborhood gang its name. Decades earlier, a streetcar of the Pacific Electric Railway ran through these blocks, and a popular cartoon of the era featured a rickety little trolley of the same kind. So the young men of the area took the cartoon's name for their own and became Toonerville. The number 13 came later, marking their allegiance to the Mexican Mafia, the prison syndicate known as lled that sits above nearly every Latino street gang in Southern California. The gang traces its roots back to at least the 1950s, starting as a small neighborhood crew and hardening over the decades into something permanent, until by the time anyone started keeping count, Rifa 13, Toonerville Rifa 13 had grown into a multi-generational organization of more than 400 members. It was never one of the famous gangs. Although names like Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street spread across cities and countries, Toonerville stayed home, its influence remaining almost entirely within Northeast Los Angeles and neighboring Glendale, a few square miles of turf that the gang treated as its whole world. What it lacked in reach, it made up for in violence, building a long record of murder, drug trafficking, witness intimidation, and extortion. Their world was small and their enemies were close. Toonerville claimed turf along Los Feliz Boulevard, San Fernando Road, and the Los Angeles River, while across the lines stood Frogtown, the Rascals, the Avenues, and a handful of others, each holding their own few blocks and each ready to spill blood over them. By the 1970s, the gangs that had risen up around Toonerville had pushed its old territory smaller and weaker, turning the neighborhood into a chessboard where the pieces shot back. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the violence in these neighborhoods had grown so constant that it spilled past anyone's control, the shootings running gang against gang and gang against the community itself, until even the men running the sets agreed it had gone too far. Rival leaders met in secret, away from police and away from each other's shooters, heavily armed and deeply distrustful, trying to settle grievances before the next round of bodies dropped. This was the world Timothy Mugie came up in, where the corners had their own laws, their own borders, and their own sentences, and he learned all of them young. Timothy Mugie was born into the edges of that world on April 27, 1973, and for a while his childhood looked ordinary. He skateboarded, and neighbors remembered a curly-haired boy who knew the block and kept to himself. His father was a white American of Scottish ancestry, and his mother Mexican American, a mix that made him an unusual face in a gang that was overwhelmingly Chicano. Then his father left the family and moved away to work, leaving the boy to the streets, and sometime after that, he joined Toonerville. His pale skin and mixed blood earned him his nicknames on those corners, where they called him Weech Rowe, the light one, and Eskimo for the half of him that was not Mexican, and he would carry both names for the rest of his life. His trouble with authority showed early. In 1989, at 16 years old and locked up in a juvenile facility, Moog pointed a shotgun at a guard, the first violence the record holds against him, a teenager turning a weapon on the people meant to contain him, and it would not be the last time he treated a uniform as a target. In 1994, at 21, he was convicted of assaulting a law enforcement officer in San Bernardino County and sentenced to 4 years, serving 3 before he walked out in 1997. That release marked the beginning, because everything that made him a legend on those streets and everything that made him a monster to the people who lived on them started the year he came home. The pattern set in fast. For the next several years, Moog moved through a revolving door, hitting the streets until violence followed and a parole violation sent him back inside, where he would serve his time, rest, and come out ready again. In March 1999, he was released to live with his grandmother in the San Gabriel Valley, an area with a far lower crime rate than the neighborhoods he came from. But within months, he was back in trouble, back in custody by early 2000, and out again that April. Detectives who worked the neighborhood watched it happen over and over until the connection became impossible to ignore, because crime in Atwater Village seemed to spike sharply every single time Moog was released from prison. When he was locked up, the area calmed, and when he came home, the bodies came with him. One detective put it plainly years later, saying that since Moog's most recent release, violent crimes in the Atwater area had skyrocketed. In this world, a young man earned his place through violence, and claiming a set meant accepting its rules, its enemies, and its sentences as your own. Putting in work for the hood was the price of belonging, and the more work a man put in, the higher he rose, and Moog learned those rules at the bottom and mastered them faster than almost anyone. Each time he came home from prison, he came back harder, more organized, and more willing than the men around him, and former members would later say he returned from his stretches a different person, someone who wanted to put Toonerville on the map and was prepared to spill any amount of blood to do it. By the turn of the millennium, the man who had once skateboarded these blocks had become their ruler. Police believed he was putting in work for Toonerville almost from the moment he first walked free, suspecting him in the 1997 killing of Ronnie Martin and later tying him to the studio shooting that left Kurup's bodyguard dead, so that each release brought a new wave of violence and each wave raised his standing inside the gang. By 2000, investigators no longer saw him as just another soldier, and they came to see Moog as the shot caller of Rifa 13 Toonerville Rifa 13, its unofficial leader, and more dangerously, its deadliest weapon. By then, he had become a figure the whole neighborhood could recognize on sight, a tattooed man with a shaved head and an eagle devouring a snake inked across his body, moving through the streets like he owned every inch of them. That tattoo would later become evidence, the kind of marking a frightened neighbor could pick out even in the chaos of a drive-by, and the boy who once kept to himself had grown into the most visible and most feared man in Atwater Village, wearing that fear openly. He had spent roughly a quarter of his young life behind bars by his mid-20s, and he had taught himself that violence was the language that moved the streets, that the man willing to use the most of it would always sit at the top. The neighborhood that raised him had become his to command, and what he did with that command over the next 2 years would put his name on a federal most wanted list and earn him comparisons to the worst killers the state of California had ever produced. He was about to build Toonerville into something that resembled less a neighborhood crew and more a small private army, and then turn that army loose. Moog did not run Toonerville like a loose gang. He ran it like a military unit, and witnesses would later describe the routines he built into the organization. He put his members through group exercise sessions and target practice, drilling them the way a sergeant drills recruits, training them to evade police, and posting armed sentries with radios at the main roads leading into Atwater Village, so the gang would know when an outsider crossed into their territory before that outsider knew he had been seen. The neighborhood became a fortress with eyes at every entrance. The structure beneath him was simple and absolute, with Moog at the top, his trusted soldiers below him, and beneath them, the young members hungry to prove themselves and rise, everything flowing through one rule of total loyalty or total consequence. In the language of the streets, putting in work meant committing crimes for the gang, and a green light meant permission to kill, and Moog handed out green lights freely, so that when rivals crossed into Toonerville, turf bodies dropped when members showed weakness they were dealt with, and when witnesses talked, they were silenced. What made him different was the way he understood fear. To Moog, fear was a currency, and every act of violence was a transaction, each murder sending a message to the rest of the neighborhood about what happened to anyone who stood against him, and he held absolute authority because everyone around him believed correctly that crossing him meant death. When he walked his men into rival turf, an LAPD detective said, "It It was like a hunter going into a big game preserve, and the streets understood the arrangement perfectly because, as another officer put it, people know you don't cross McGee, and if you cross him, you're dead. There was one more thing that set him apart, which was that most men who reach the top of a gang stop pulling triggers themselves and run the operation from behind, insulated by the soldiers beneath them. Muggy killed with his own hands. A detective who spent decades on gang units said this was rare at his level, that Muggy committed the acts personally rather than ordering them from a distance. And when the leader does the killing himself, the fear changes shape because there's no buffer, no layer of deniability, only the man and the gun. The killings follow the chronology, and they tell you everything about how he operated. In 1997, two members of the Rascals named Juan Cardiel and Pedro Sanchez ran for their lives through Atwater Village with Muggy chasing them down, and Cardiel was shot in the back and paralyzed from the waist down. Sanchez ducked into a gas station and crouched behind glass he believed was bulletproof, certain the barrier between him and the shooter would hold, but Muggy walked up and fired through the door and hit him in the back because the glass was not bulletproof. Sanchez survived, and both men named Muggy as the gunman, a detail that would matter enormously a decade later when both of them sat in a courtroom and suddenly could not remember a thing. Later that same year, on October 14, 1997, came the 28 bullets when Ronnie Martin of Frogtown, one of Toonerville's most hated rivals, was left dead on the street. The sheer overkill of it, 28 rounds fired into one man, said something about the person holding the gun, and though Muggy was not tied to that murder for years, it was the work that would eventually anchor his death sentence. Then the revolving door turned as a parole violation sent him back to prison through late 1997 and beyond before he came home again in 1999. On October 17th of that year, gunfire erupted outside the Echo Sounds recording studio in Atwater Village, a studio where rappers from Tupac to Coolio had once worked. Late that night, around 11:40, a crew connected to Death Row Records gathered on the patio after finishing a session, among them the rapper Kurup and the producer Daz Dillinger, cousin of Snoop Dogg, when at least two gunmen confronted them and opened fire without warning. The men scrambled for the door and shoved a soda machine in front of it to shield themselves, but the shooter ran up and fired over and around the machine to keep hitting them through the gaps, and Kurup's bodyguard, 23-year-old Dwayne Draws Dupree, was killed at the scene while two others were wounded. Investigators first wondered whether a hidden track on Kurup's album that insulted rival rappers had drawn the attack, but in time, Muggy and an affiliate were linked to the shooting. Another parole violation, another stretch inside, and another release. This time in April 2000 was when the killing went into overdrive. In June 2000, 16-year-old Ryan Gonzalez was walking home from a party when he was ambushed and killed in the 3300 block of Silver Lake Boulevard inside Toonerville territory. Gonzalez ran with the Rascals and shared Muggy's nickname, going by WEH Road 2, and investigators came to believe the motive was that simple, that the neighborhood was not big enough for two men with the same street name, so one of them had to go. An arrest warrant went out for Muggy within weeks, but the law would not catch him for years. The following month, Muggy turned his weapons on the police themselves. On July 4th, 2000, two LAPD officers chased a robbery suspect's car straight into the heart of Toonerville turf around 3:30 in the morning, and as they pursued, someone dragged a washing machine into the road, then pushed a bicycle into their path. Gunmen on foot opened fire, tearing a hole through one officer's pants and striking the patrol car door, and a passenger in the suspect vehicle pulled an Uzi-style submachine gun, but the officers fought their way out from behind a tree, rammed the car to a stop, and survived. 3 men were arrested and given life terms, and they refused to name the shooters even for lighter sentences, while the officers were later awarded the LAPD Medal of Valor. Muggy was suspected of being one of the gunmen, allegedly using a police scanner to track the chase, and he was eventually convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder for the ambush. The bodies kept coming. In September 2000, a 17-year-old high school student named Marty Roybal was shot dead while tagging near the Red Car River Park, and a homeless man named David Martin, likely a witness, was killed at the scene with him, with Muggy suspected in both deaths. After one more prison stint, this time for a narcotics-related parole violation, Muggy was released in May 2001, and the next 5 months became the most violent stretch of his life, in which he was suspected of shooting 9 people, killing 6, and wounding 3. It began on June 11th when he allegedly opened fire on a car passing through the affluent Los Feliz area near the freeway, killing 21-year-old Manuel Apodaca and leaving his pregnant girlfriend with severe brain damage, though their baby was delivered alive. In July, police say he drove past a furniture warehouse, saw a young worker he did not recognize, and ordered his men to kill the stranger simply because he was unknown, and the order was carried out. In August came the worst of it, when after a woman named Sherry Wasowski reported him to police for dealing drugs out of his sister's house, Moo-Gee allegedly murdered her along with 2 witnesses, her 64-year-old mother and a neighbor, in a single triple homicide. All of this he wrote down. Police later found a notebook filled with his rap lyrics, verses that bragged about killing and about his hatred of police, and described his own murders in detail. And because he knew the danger of putting it on paper, he wrote inside the cover that everything in the book was a work of fiction. That disclaimer would not save him. He even compared himself in those pages to the fictional killer Freddy Krueger and to the outlaw Jesse James, casting himself as a figure of legend. And the most chilling lines made his intentions plain, writing about making certain that witnesses never reached the stand, that no informant against him would survive to testify. The notebook read less like an artist's diary and more like a confession written in advance. The physical evidence matched the words, because investigators came to believe that the same weapon connected several of the shootings, a gun Moo-Gee allegedly kept close, leaving his signature across multiple crime scenes, so that the man who killed personally also kept the instrument personally. He would prove every promise he made on those pages, and the proof would come in the form of the one murder that changed everything, the killing of a witness who made the mistake of trusting the police to keep her safe. On the night of November 9, 2001, Moo-Gee and a fellow gang member went looking for revenge over a comrade killed hours earlier, and they found a rival named Dwayne Natividad driving with his girlfriend, 25-year-old Marjorie Mendoza, and her teenage friend in the back seat. Without a word, the gunman pulled in front of the car and opened fire, and though Natividad threw the car in reverse and sped away, Mendoza was hit again and again and died at the hospital. She had 3 young children. In the chaos, Moo-Gee dropped his girlfriend's cell phone at the scene and asked a friend named Christina Duran to go back and find it, but she could not, and police did, so that phone became evidence. Days later, Duran sat in an interrogation room with LAPD detectives, and on videotape admitted that Moo-Gee was involved in Mendoza's death, visibly shaking and saying again and again that she was afraid of what would happen to her for talking. 2 days after she spoke to police, on the night she celebrated her 29th birthday, Christina Duran was executed, allegedly shot 5 times in the right side of the head. That was the message, that you talk to police and you join the dead, and after Duran, the neighborhood went silent in a way that would shape everything that came next. By the fall of 2002, the violence had drawn a force unlike anything the area had seen, as many as 60 local and federal investigators forming a task force with the single purpose of taking Moo-Gee down. The U.S. Marshals joined with aircraft and vehicles once it became clear Moo-Gee was running Toonerville from out of state, and he was placed on the Marshals' 15 most wanted fugitives list, one of a questioning in nearly a dozen homicides, with rewards climbing past $50,000, and America's Most Wanted filming a segment on the manhunt. For months, he stayed a step ahead, splitting his time between Atwater Village, Las Vegas, and Arizona, never staying anywhere more than a week, and thrown off the police by hiding inside rival gangs' neighborhoods, walking through the turf of men who wanted him dead. When officers later searched his belongings, they found t-shirts that read, "Run, jump, throw a donut, and fugitive. Can't see me," so that he was a wanted killer, wearing jokes about being a wanted killer. The end came through a newspaper when a reader of the Mojave Desert News recognized Moo-Gee's photo as a man living in Bullhead City, Arizona, where his father owned a business. On February 11, 2003, surveillance teams tracked him to an apartment, and after roughly 20 hours of watching, more than 25 officers pulled over the car he was riding in. Moo-Gee surrendered without a struggle and refused to speak, and when an officer who knew him tried to talk, Moo-Gee only glared and smiled, while the woman driving the car had no idea who he really was. His violence did not stop behind bars. In January 2005, while awaiting trial in the men's central jail, Moo-Gee led a riot, and as a shot caller of the highest security row, he commanded inmates to attack deputies with fruit, urine, and bleach before ordering them to smash their porcelain sinks into jagged weapons. After it was over, told that one officer he had assaulted survived, Moo-Gee said he would have to stab the man next time, and he was later sentenced to 75 years to life for the riot. In September 2007, Moo-Gee finally went on trial for the murders of Ronnie Martin, Ryan Gonzalez, and Marjorie Mendoza, along with several attempted murders, after prosecutors had originally charged him with 9 killings but dropped 6 counts before trial, citing unreliable witnesses. In court, Deputy District Attorney Hoon Chun told the jury that, unlike most gang members who kill for revenge, Moo-Gee seemed to kill for sport, like a serial killer, and evidence showed he had taunted at least one victim, telling him to die like a man before firing into his skull. The fear he had built worked even inside the courtroom, where Cardiel and Sanchez, who had named him the night they were shot a decade earlier, now claimed they could not remember who pulled the trigger. Several witnesses had to be placed under protection, and some shook on the stand, while outside his mother walked Atwater Village, handing out leaflets asking the neighborhood to pray for her son. And through all of it, Muji smiled at the spectators. On October 25, 2007, the jury found him guilty of all 3 murders and 4 attempted murders, and when it came to deciding his fate, the first jury deadlocked 10-2 in favor of death. So the penalty phase had to be retried before a second jury agreed unanimously. On January 9, 2009, Judge Robert J. Perry sentenced him to death, saying Muji treated killing as some kind of perverse sport, as if he was hunting human game, and calling him a committed killer and an obvious danger to society. He went to death row at San Quentin, and when California Governor Gavin Newsom placed a moratorium on executions in 2019, Muji was moved off death row into general population, so that the man who killed for fear and built his power on it seemed finally to be contained. Then, in April 2025, the California Supreme Court reversed everything. The ruling did not turn on his guilt, but on a single juror, because during the 2007 deliberations, a juror who doubted the prosecution had been removed and replaced by an alternate. That juror had questioned why gang members would risk their lives to testify against a man known for killing witnesses, and whether their rehearsed-sounding stories could be trusted, and the trial judge called it bias and dismissed him. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous opinion by Justice Goodwin Liu, found that the record did not support removing the juror, holding that a juror who relies on his own reasoning or simply rejects the evidence has not refused to deliberate, and the convictions and the death sentence were vacated. Sit with the weight of that. The juror was dismissed for doubting that witnesses would dare to speak against Muji, and the reason so few witnesses ever dared was the terror Muji himself created. Christina Duran spoke, and Duran died. Cardiel and Sanchez forgot, and an entire neighborhood learned to see nothing. The silence he built with bullets became the exact silence a juror found suspicious, and that suspicion, decades later, became his path off death row. The reversal does not free him and does not declare him innocent. He remains in prison under his other sentences, and Los Angeles prosecutors must now decide whether to retry a case where so many of the witnesses are dead, gone, or unwilling to remember. Christina Duran cannot testify from the grave a second time. The gang he built to dominate Atwater Village did not stand still while he sat in a cell. In 2010, a year after his death sentence, a Mexican mafia member imprisoned at Pelican Bay imposed a truce on the old rivals. Toonerville, Frogtown, and the Rascals were ordered to stop killing each other and instead work together to control the drug trade along the Los Angeles River from Elysian Park to Burbank, taxing dealers for the benefit of lled. Federal prosecutors called the arrangement a self-described New World Order, a so-called United Neighborhoods of Gangs. It did not last. A federal racketeering investigation eventually swept the coalition up, charging more than 20 members and exposing how the prison syndicate had been orchestrating the whole machine from behind the walls. The blocks Muji once ruled outlived him, and so did the larger forces that always sat above him. What remains is the cost. Ronnie Martin, Ryan Gonzalez, Marjorie Mendoza, and the others left in the ground. Mendoza's 3 young children growing up without a mother, and 8 children of Muji's own who grew up visiting prison glass. One of them later saying that people still step back when they hear his name, though he was only a small boy when his father was arrested and barely knew him at all. It is a neighborhood that learned generation after generation that speaking the truth could cost a life, and as one Los Angeles Times reporter put it, even in a city with more than 150 gang slayings a year, Muji's murders stood out. For years, detectives could barely link Muji to his crimes because neighborhood residents, fellow gang members, and even his rivals refused to talk to police out of fear of what would follow. And that silence was his greatest weapon, more reliable than any gun. It outlasted his arrest, his trial, and his death sentence, and now it has outlasted the convictions themselves. He may have beaten the death chamber, but he will still almost certainly die in a cage, and the streets that raised him, the streets he ruled and terrorized, have moved on without him. Their old crime scenes paved over by coffee shops and renovated homes, carrying underneath all of it a silence he taught them that no court has ever managed to break.